Yeah, g'day YouTubers. Tinker O'Toole again here with another video. Today we're going to talk about the best angles for your chainsaw grinder. There's really only two angles that you really need to worry about, and that is the grinder head on this particular model, which is a clone of an Oregon 511. The actual head moves. The normal position of this that most people would keep that at is 60 degrees. There's an adjustment on the back, a little knob, and there's a scale on the back. So I'll just show you that. So there's the knob there, and you can see the scale here. Goes from 90 degrees to about 55, but if you move it right over in the corner, you'll have 40 degrees. So that's pretty straightforward to operate. It's just a matter of loosening the knob there, and you can move this into the spot. But 60 degrees is generally what most people use. If you want to be a little bit more aggressive, you can go 55, you can even go 50. And if you zoom in on these type of grinders, you can see that there's a scale on the back here as well, and you can read that. So that works quite well. As you can see, it's set on 60, so just a matter of looking at that without going around the other side. So the technical name for that is called top plate cutting angle. And the reason it's called top plate cutting angle is because on a, especially if we look at a full chisel chain, and even on a semi-chisel you'll see it, you've got two angles here. This is the cutting angle here, this beveled angle. It's what we refer to as a compounded bevel angle because you've got the top plate angle here, which is generally set at 30 degrees. And the top plate cutting angle is the grinding wheel coming in and putting this face on here. So if this is the top plate cutting angle, then we need to look at the top plate. And that's the angles here. It starts from 0 in the middle, goes to 35 to the right side, 35 to the left side. So what's the most common is generally 30 degrees. So if we've got 60 degrees on the top plate cutting angle and 30 degrees on here, is there room for variation? Yes, as I said before, you could have this at 50 degrees, which is much more aggressive. You could certainly put that on 50 degrees in your softwood. And if we put this on 30 degrees, generally speaking, you can use 25 degrees in really hard wood. In really softwood, and I mean really softwood like Pinus radiata, you could get away with 35 degrees. Only one little word of caution, that it's not a good idea to play around with all different angles. And the reason I say that is for every time that you keep playing around and changing angles, it means that you've got to grind off excess metal more than what you normally would, sharpening the chain. Because when you angle the top plate cutting angle or the top plate, the grinder is in a different position and it's got to grind the metal away until the new profile is formed. So if you keep swapping backwards and forwards, you'll find out that you'll grind your chain down twice as fast as what you normally would. So yeah, try and decide on the angles that you want to use and keep them like that. So anytime you grab a chain, you don't have to worry about this chain's on this angle and that chain's on that angle, because there's no way of really identifying what chain's what unless they're a different brand. And that's probably not a bad idea if you are going to change angles. Get a different brand, and you might say, this is my full chisel and this is the settings for it, and this is my semi-chisel and it's a different brand and this is the settings for that one. So generally speaking, 60 degrees here will get you out of trouble in most situations, and 30 degrees will get you out of trouble in most situations there, whether it's semi-chisel or full chisel. The other adjustment for full chisel is that this grinder is capable, and a lot of grinders are, that you can tilt the vise. So if we loosen this, you can tilt the vise this way or that way. And to understand which is the correct way to tilt it, if you're standing at the back of the grinder and you look at a right-hand tooth, which is the closest to the operator, you push this knob away from you and the vise tilts over this way. So if you're doing a left-hand tooth, which is the closest to the back of the grinder, pull this knob towards you and it tilts over that way. So 10 degrees downward tilt, the whole idea of that is that it thins out the working corner so you don't end up with too much hook. This little point here thins it out so that it doesn't have too much hook. We can put a slide up of a tooth that's probably got a little bit too much hook, and you don't want that. Too much hook can cause a lot of problems. It can cause the tooth in the working corner to bend over. So yeah, years ago, going back 30 years ago, still recommended that you hold the file, if you're using a file, that you hold the file about 10% above the top of the tooth. Then it went to 20%. Now still recommend 25% of the file is held above the tooth. And by doing that, you end up with a profile that looks like that. Nice, beautiful shape and no hook. Hook is another word for error. So if you've got what we refer too much hook, a little tiny bit of hook's okay, okay? So, but typically what I'm seeing on full chisel these days is a profile that looks a little bit more like that, and with a little pointy tip on it. Nice little straight section rather than that defined C shape. That's what I'm seeing on a lot, especially Stihl's RS. You can see it on there. And one that really stands out, that's really aggressive, it's got a 40-degree top plate cutting angle, is Husqvarna's C85 X-Cut. Very, very aggressive. So pretty much to sum it up, the best all-round angles for softwood, medium wood and hardwood, green hardwood that is 60 degrees here on the grinding wheel, which is top plate cutting angle, and the top plate here, 30 degrees. 10 degrees tilt is optional. It certainly can't hurt. If you're grinding your chain and it doesn't look like it's got much hook in it, then you don't have to worry about 10 degrees downward tilt. But if you feel that the C shape is a little bit too pointy and it looks like it's got too much hook, use a 10 degrees downward tilt. The chain manufacturer should tell you whether it's required or not. A lot of Carlton and Oregon chain use 10 degrees downward tilt. Still don't recommend it. We'll put a slide up of a Stihl RS chain straight out of the factory. And that's typically what I'm seeing on a lot of full chisels these days. So when you file, and if you keep your file 25% or a quarter of its diameter above the top of the tooth, you'll find out that you'll eliminate any hook. You won't get hook. And I think that's the reason they don't worry about 10 degrees downward tilt anymore, because the file's held up in a higher position and you eliminate that problem. But certainly 10 degrees downward tilt can't do any harm, because what it does is thin out that point. That's what it does. Okay, so the next thing that's quite critical, and it's been neglected, is people dressing the wheel. And that's very interesting, because when we look at an Oregon type style grinder compared to a Stihl USG grinder, it's totally different in the way that they dress the wheel. On an Oregon style grinder or Taconic, you'll get a little card like this, and have a look, it's got 5 sizes on there. You've got 1/4 inch, 0.325, 3/8, 4/04, and 1/2 inch chain, 7/16. But the funny thing is, you only get 2 wheels with it. There's only 2 wheels that are generally available. And the wheel sizes that normally come with a grinder are 3.2 millimeters in width and 4.7 millimeters in width. You can get a 6 millimeter wheel for the rakers, but I never ever do the rakers with a grinder. I always do them with a progressive depth gauge. And that's another thing. When you do use your grinder, you should always at least check the rakers, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Now, the other thing that's interesting that we'll talk about, we've just spoken about dressing the wheel and using one of these cards that you put it in there and you're looking to duplicate that shape, a symmetrical U shape, which is all virtually a half a circle on the bottom. So that's symmetrical. Interesting enough, Stihl only dress one side of their wheels, and they use a metal template and it's asymmetrical. So what they recommend is that you dress the wheel to a file size. Now, they've got a wheel, instead of 4.7 millimeters, it's about 4 millimeters thick, and you dress the wheel to the file size. So we'll have a look at that, and you could buy one of those cards from your Stihl dealer, a metal template card, and you could dress this wheel here to the file size rather than a symmetrical dressing. So this is the metal template you get when you get a Stihl USG grinder. And if we just lift it up and you have a look, it's got radius 1.7 for a 1/4 inch Pico chain, radius 2 millimeters for a 1/4 inch and 3/8 Pico, a radius of 2 mil, a radius of 2.4 for 3.25 millimeter chain, a radius of 2.6 millimeters for a standard 3/8 chain, and a radius of 404. And there's a radius of 3.5 millimeter there, and it says 15 mil. Not too sure what that one's for. So Stihl dress their stone, as I said before, for file size. And if you actually have a close look, you'll notice it's straight on one side, right? So it's straight line, and the radius is here in that section there, right? And then on the other side, that's for hexa. So that's a hexa. And that was a bit of a one that I made as well. So, yeah. So, dressing your wheel for file size, to me, is the better way to go. It's a little bit more time consuming, but nonetheless, it does work. Now, what I did here was a little drawing of a grinding wheel. And I measured about 5 millimeters in width, which was close enough to 4.7 mil. And this is a standard type radius, 2.5 millimeter radius. So that's on a 5 mil wheel, 4.7. And then I put a radius of 4 millimeters on there, and you can see the difference. So it's dressed on one side. So you can get a 4 millimeter radius. Now, a 4 millimeter radius is equal to 8 millimeters in width. Same as a 2.5 millimeter radius is equal to 5 millimeters. And this is what Stihl do. It's asymmetrical. It's dressed on one side only, right? Which is very similar to this idea that I've got here, that if this is your standard grinding wheel, right? Let's see if we can focus on that better. This is a 4.7 millimeter wheel. This is your standard type grind of the wheel, and you would use this type of card here so that you get that type of shape. And then when we look here, you can see that I've dressed, if this is the wheel, you can dress it with a much larger radius. So it's something to consider, that if you really do want to duplicate the file, you could use one of these metal radius cards available from Stihl. So all you have to do is go down to your Stihl dealer. There's a part number there, 5203-893-6308. One of the good things about a lot of Stihl products, it always has the part number on there. Not too sure, except for this gauge. Doesn't have it either, which also is another point that I'd like to bring up, that this is referred to a constant depth gauge and will only ever set the depth of 0.65 millimeters, whereas a progressive depth gauge will set each individual tooth based on the wear of the tooth rather than at a fixed height. By the time you get to the end of the life of the tooth, your raker depth will be about 1.3 millimeters using this gauge, whereas this gauge, at the end of the life, it'll still be 0.65 of a millimeter. And that's why if you use this type of gauge, you'll find out that when your chain gets about halfway worn, it doesn't cut as good. So to briefly recap on the best chainsaw angles for a grinder, it is 60 degrees for the top plate cutting angle. It is 30 degrees on here, and 10 degrees tilt is optional, depends whether the manufacturer recommended or not. I hope that information helps. You're not going to invent or make some U-Butte angle, even though you look at your grinder and it's got multiple positions. It's all been done. Millions of people have tried all different angles, and most people are going to come back to 60 degrees on here, 30 degrees on here, or 25 degrees on here on frozen hardwood. And you can go, if you want to, in softwood, you can quite easily go to 50 degrees. And the other thing that I'd like to say is that when you dress the wheel can make a big difference to the profile. So if you have a basic U-type shape, that's okay. If you've just got semi-chisel, or you just want a fairly ordinary full chisel. But if you've got a full chisel that has a little peak on it, it's a little bit different side. The side plate is a little bit different. It could be 85 degrees like Stihl's RS, or it could be like Husqvarna's X-Cut. Then you need to sort of just take a little bit of time and dress the wheel so that you get that shape if you want to duplicate that shape. So, yeah, look, I hope that information helps. Just remember that 60 degrees here on the top plate cutting angle is going to get you out of trouble. Unless you know otherwise, I wouldn't play around with any more than 60 degrees. And on the top plate here, I'd stick with 30 degrees. And it's up to you whether you use a 10 degrees downward tilt or not. I hope that information in the video is really helpful, because a lot of people can get a grinder and not 100% sure what the angles are. And the only other thing that I'd like to mention between semi-chisel and full chisel is full chisel is generally about 10% faster. And some of the more advanced full chisels like the Hexa and the X-Cut are probably 15% faster, give or take. And that's about it. So, you know, you're not going to make some special type of profile that's going to cut 20, 30% faster. If it does, it won't last very long. If you go too aggressive, it'll blunt very, very quick. So just be aware of that. By all means, experiment. What I always say to everyone, there's nothing wrong with trying something. You can try something, and if it works and it works good for you, it may not work good for me. Or if I tell you something, or I tell you a profile, I don't know what timber you've got. But generally speaking, the 60 degrees here on the top plate cutting angle, right, that's going to get you out of trouble out of 99% of cases, and your 30 degrees on here will get you out of trouble as well. You don't have to use a 10 degrees downward tilt unless it's recommended by the chain manufacturer. I hope that information helps. Thanks for watching. Bye for now. And please subscribe, and comments are always welcome.